Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Kurt Smith with Applied Pavement Technology, and I'll be serving as your host for today's webinar on an introduction to life cycle assessment for pavements, part 2, EPDs and PCRs. This is the 10th and final session in our series of webinars on sustainability that were developed under the FHWA Sustainable Pavements program and cover all stages of the pavement life cycle. Before we get started, I want to mention just a few housekeeping items. This webinar is scheduled for a total of 1 hour and will consist of a 45-minute formal presentation followed by a 15-minute question and answer session. The questions will be answered at the end of the formal presentation, but you may submit your questions at any time during the presentation using the questions box on your control panel. If you don't see the question box, you may need to click on the little orange arrow icon on the control panel in order to see and display the settings. At the end of the session, we will work to answer as many of the questions as we can within the remaining time. But as we've indicated in previous webinars, plans are currently being made to organize 2 additional webinar events to help address all of the questions that have been raised. Details on those additional webinar events will be made available once those plans are finalized. After the conclusion of the webinar today, a copy of the presentation will be shared with all registrants via email, along with a link to the webinar recording once it's processed. And during today's presentation, we'll also be sharing a copy of a recent FHWA tech brief on EPDs in the handout box, and we'll also be providing a link to that document in the chat box. So you may want to monitor those 2 parts of the control panel. Throughout today's webinar, we'll be using a number of different acronyms referring to different materials, products, and processes. We'll work to introduce these as they are used throughout the webinar, but this master list will be available in the presentation that we share with you later. So now to get things started, I'd like to introduce Ms. Monica Girardo with FHWA, who will preface our webinar with a quick look at FHWA's Sustainable Pavements program.
Perfect. Thank you, Kirk. Good morning and good afternoon to some of you. Again, my name is Monica Jurado, and I'm the Pavement and Materials Engineer with the Federal Highway Administration Resource Center. And I want to thank you for joining us for the Sustainable Pavement System, a webinar series. And welcome you to our 10th and final webinar, an introduction to life cycle assessment for pavements, part 2, EPDs and PCRs. Our presenter for today will be Mr. John Davies, but before we get started, I would like to let you know a little bit about the FHWA Sustainable Pavements program, which began in 2010 with the vision and mission to enhance the knowledge and practice of designing, constructing, and maintaining more sustainable pavements through stakeholder engagement, education, and the development of guidance and tools, which this webinar is one of those tools developed by the Sustainable Pavements program. This is the 10th webinar of 10 webinars, and you will receive 1 professional development hour per webinar. And upon the completion of 8 out of the 10 webinars, you will receive a course completion certificate. Within the Federal Highway Administration Sustainable Pavements program, we developed the FHWA Sustainability Ambassadors, which is a group of FHWA employees from different disciplines whose goal is to expand the knowledge and outreach within their field that complements the Sustainable Pavements program. With that, I would like to introduce Mr. John Davies, who is a Sustainability Ambassador. Mr. John Davies is an environmental protection specialist with the Federal Highway Administration's Office of Natural Environment. His work focuses on tools, methods, and research supporting energy analysis and policy development. He has led the development of tools to support life cycle assessment of planning related decisions, including the infrastructure carbon estimator, or better known as ICE, and the Energy and Emissions Reduction Policy Analysis Tool, EarthPath. Before coming to Federal Highway in 2008, Mr. Davis worked as a climate issues for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And with that, I'll pass on the microphone to Mr. John Davies.
Thanks so much, Monica. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk about some topics that I think are really compelling and certainly I believe of emerging importance in the realm of sustainable pavements. Those topics are what are environmental product declarations, and what are the product category rules that govern the development of EPDs. I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to say a little bit more about what those things are, some current and emerging issues associated with both, and also to introduce you to some resources that are available through FHWA's Sustainable Pavements program. Just a quick word about the context and also the motivation for the actual development of environmental product declarations. State highway agencies have always been in the business of assessing and choosing materials to meet their transportation needs. But then the question is, if you're looking to really understand the environmental impacts, of construction materials that are being used in projects, what are the data that can be used to inform that analysis? And it's not until relatively recently that I realized that there is an emerging resource that's available in the form of environmental product declarations, which in some ways can be seen as a platform for the industry to communicate environmental impacts of products to their customers. And partly as a result of the development of EPDs, state highway agencies and state governments more generally, I believe, are really able to start to address some really important questions. And I think we've started to see some really important state level action. Just to cite a couple of very quick examples, the California Department of Transportation and also the Oregon DOT have started requiring EPDs for pavement and other transportation materials, or particularly for reporting and benchmarking. And there actually are requirements in those states for the use of EPDs when buying steel for procurement. State of MnDOT has the Minnesota DOT has started educating stakeholders about the purpose and application of EPDs in the realm of sustainable pavements. There are incentives that are being developed in Portland, Oregon, and a host of other locations are starting to look very, very seriously at construction materials and and the information that can help and inform good decisions. One other point to make is that green rating systems such as LEED, FHWA's Invest tool, and also like the Green Roads tool, could potentially benefit from this kind of information. So looking forward to talking more about what exactly is part of environmental product declarations and ways that information can be used. So the question emerges, what are EPDs? And I think in a fairly simple sense, it's a report that that talks about environmental impacts of things like resource use or energy or emissions, and they're associated with the manufacture or production of construction materials, and in this particular context. So it could include asphalt, cement, asphalt mixtures, concrete mixtures, etc. But within the reports, what's fundamentally being provided is a life cycle perspective, on particular environmental impact categories, and in some respects, the EPDs could be understood as being somewhat analogous to. I mean, they are a summary table that's analogous to, say, a nutrition label like the one that you see here in the top right hand corner of this slide. So it's just it's a lot of complex analysis that's been carefully thought out ahead of time, with a good deal of stakeholder input, and following a set of consensus-based rules and what are called product category rules. But they ultimately provide a transparent and consistent way of assessing particular environmental impacts of interest. One final point to make here is that EPDs are not required at the federal level. There are no laws or federal regulations. Obviously, in some states there's been a good deal of activity, but I think that's an important point to be understood throughout this presentation, is that there are no federal requirements that drive the development of EPDs, or would necessarily ensure consistency across EPDs. In terms of just sort of the process of what needs to happen for an EPD to be developed. This is a process that can be a little bit tricky to get jump started, but actually can start to I think operate in a fairly streamlined way once once certain things have happened. But if you, for instance, an individual manufacturer wants to talk about the environmental performance of their products, there's a series of steps that that need to be followed to ultimately make that EPD a reality. The first is that there need to be rules in place to allow the particular product to be analyzed, both sort of on its own, and most critically, relative to competing products. Just say that there needs to be a set of of rules or requirements or guidelines in the form of product category rules. Those need to have been developed by a convening of stakeholders who've been organized by what's called a program operator. So it would be someone who sort of leads the discussion, and in the United States that would most commonly be an industry association, like for instance, the National Ready Mix Concrete Association or the National Asphalt Pavement Association. But once those rules are in place, then it becomes quite feasible to perform other steps. With the rules established, the life cycle assessment can actually be performed. It can be fairly sort of comprehensive and rigorous analysis, but it's once you have the process in place, it's very, very doable. The third step is development of the actual report. The subsequent step is review of the document itself to make sure that it's consistent with the underlying product category rules, and then the final step is the publication of the report itself. to make this a little bit more real, this is an example EPD that's shown for an asphalt mixture. And as you can see, what it really contains in looking by row is a set of of specified impact indicators. In this case, including ozone depletion, acidification, eutrophication, and smog. A set of units to express those impacts, and then an enumeration of the impacts by specific sort of elements of the life cycle process. So in this case, you see enumeration of or the impacts disaggregated by materials, by the transport of the materials, and then the production of the product itself. So again, it's kind of like a sort of elaborate nutrition label, albeit with a few additional columns. And here you see a little bit sort of more detail on the with actual sort of life cycle stages that are broken out in the columns above, and they're fundamentally are sort of different sort of scales of analysis that are shown in the rows below. One level is cradle to gate analysis, which would cover essentially elements of the creation of the product itself, from the actual sort of extraction of raw materials up to the gate of the manufacturing site. So hence the cradle to gate nomenclature. But this is all before you actually get to the paving site. Then a second sort of scale of analysis would be cradle to site. So it includes everything from the cradle to gate analysis, plus transportation to the site, and then the operation of construction and paving equipment. And then in the final row, you see the cradle to grave analysis, and this is very, very comprehensive. So it includes what was mentioned before with the products and then the construction process. It includes potentially the use of the actual operation of vehicles that would use, for instance, a particular transportation facility, and then it would include everything associated with that facility itself until you have your first reconstruction. So it would include any demolition that would be necessary for sort of getting rid of expiring materials, the transport of those materials, and waste processing, and ultimately disposal. So again, the analysis can be structured in some number of different ways, and again, that's a really sort of important thing to establish up front for purposes of conducting the analysis in a structured and systematic way. This is an interesting slide about I guess how EPDs are used, and I think really what kind of value they provide to transportation agencies, and then to the public more broadly. And it's I think in many respects it's a fairly EPDs are built on I think on sort of an elegant process that ultimately aims to provide verifiable and and transparent information, and that information itself is it's sort of carefully structured in ways that ideally can support the development of of specific performance metrics that could be used in things such as procurement. Obviously this is that information can be used to communicate good stewardship, from an agency perspective, or also from a manufacturer perspective. But in both cases, the analysis can allow agencies or industry to show sort of where they are and progress they're making. In the case of agencies, they can actually conduct life cycle assessment on facilities that they're responsible for. They can support sort of policy development. They can support more sustainable pavement design decisions, and then and also more sustainable pavement management practices. And then and I think this is also an interesting topic in terms of how agencies can use EPDs. And I think in sort of the simplest form, I guess EPDs could be understood as a source of information, and and agencies could just simply collect this information and have it available for analysis if they need it. One example would be using, it's in the fourth bullet here, using EPDs as input for life cycle assessment, for environmental review, or or NEPA documentation. With the information that's provided, that all becomes sort of increasingly that it becomes increasingly easier. But I think another point is that I think agencies can play, an active and constructive role in the development of EPDs. This is something that's not certainly standard every place, and agencies have, I think, a potential leadership role that they can play. Again, EPDs can be used to help demonstrate progress toward agency goals, or agencies' roles in supporting state goals. Agencies can use EPDs to help acclimate industry to the idea of developing EPDs, and and pilots, I think, can go a long way to to making that an increased likelihood. And then ultimately the hope is that information from EPDs can help guide well-informed procurement decisions, so that agencies know what they're getting, not only from sort of a performance perspective, but in terms of environmental outcomes. And and to do all of this, agencies have to be active and engage stakeholders in the creation of the rules, the product category rules that are they're used to develop EPDs. I think it's helpful to look at actual examples of EPDs, and here's a quick summary of some that have been developed. It's been certainly encouraging to see more and more come online over the past couple of years. So anyway, I've talked sort of obliquely about product category rules, and want to put a little bit more meat on the bone. And fundamentally, product category rules are they're requirements, guidelines, or rules themselves to that are developed on a industry consensus basis to to support the development EPDs. And and the rules themselves are really important to allow for, I think, both transparency of any manufacturer's analysis, and also consistency across manufacturers, and potentially across different industry groups themselves. Again, this point can't this can probably not be emphasized enough. Product category rules and EPDs are not required by federal law or regulations, so that in some respects does create certain challenges But I'll talk a little bit more about ways that some of those challenges are being overcome. And this figure shows I think it's a very nice summary of sort of what needs to happen if if a member of an industry group is thinking about developing an EPD and says, hey, I need to have a product category rule to make this possible. And if you're sort of new to this, the question is, how do you sort of think about this in in a structured way? They're basically these two boxes, the left and the right, summarize the complete process and the sort of the thinking behind it. But the one that's labeled sort of Group A presumes that there is a product category rule available, and that it does not need to be updated. So you go from the sort of diamond in the left-hand box all the way over to the vertical line A in the right-hand box. And the simple point is, if there's a product category rule available and it doesn't need to be updated, you use that product category rule. Now, there are a couple of other cases here that you may have sort of figured out. If there's a product category rule, but it needs to be updated, that means that the industry itself needs to collect or produce life cycle assessment to sort of update the product category rule itself, and then there's a series of steps subsequent to that involve creation of committees, the development of a draft product category rule, consultation with stakeholders, independent third-party review, assessment to determine whether the requirements of the rule have been met, and if not, to sort of iterate back. And then the final category is if there is not a rule at all, then you have to go through the process of finding a program operator, such as sort of an industry an industry trade group, for instance, that might lead the process. You would identify the product operator. Then again, there would be the data collection, formation of committees, the development of the PCR itself with review by stakeholders, review by third party, and then determination of whether rules have been met. But in any event, this is the flow chart that that shows how to think through that process. And again, in terms of the role of agencies in this process, I think it's tempting to think of this as something that's that can be largely sort of industry driven, but I would submit that there is really an important role for agencies to play, that they should be involved in the development of the underlying product category rules. They should be involved in the actual review of the rules themselves. That they can play a role in encouraging the industries to to jumpstart the process. And then I think there's this really important point of encouraging harmonization when you have different rules, potentially across different industries. I think agencies can be really important advocates and market drivers to allow for sort of more consistency across across those different groups and then the rules that those groups use. So key things to think about when either developing or reviewing product category rules. One, and I think maybe it almost seems it's sort of so obvious that I know I would probably forget about it. But the question is, when you're setting up the rules, do you have like just the right impact categories to align with actual agency goals? So it's to say if for instance an agency is part of, say, a no-zone non-attainment area and has some goals related to reduction of, say, ozone precursors, then that might be a particular sort of impact category that would that should be included in the PCR itself. Obviously there are some pretty important considerations in terms of understanding the actual product that's being assessed, and especially important when you're thinking about specific pavement mixtures. So are you actually analyzing the kinds of products that that the agency would specify for its projects? And then there's another issue that I think is really important, but to allow for more comparability sort of across the EPDs, you need to have specification of like actual background data sets. So it's to say if electricity is an input and there are background data sets, you want they can be used to understand certain emissions rates that would be associated with the generation of that electricity. You'd want to have everybody using the same data set, and I think agencies, transportation agencies, can and government in general can play an important role in making sure that there's consistency on that front. Again, there are examples of product category rules that that have been published. They're sort of more underway, but I would commend these particular examples. But I think this is another interesting topic. What's going on with product category rules and EPDs. To me, it's one of these things that seems both incredibly sort of doable on one level and then incredibly hard on the other level. And what are the what's going on, and what are the sort of big issues that everyone's dealing with? And I think as I mentioned earlier, there really is not harmonization of product category rules. I mean, this is the big challenge. There are a lot of potential sort of components to a product category rule, and you would you'd think that both the products and then the processes that are necessary to enable development of those products, that there can just be there's both a lot of sort of breadth to that, and then a lot of different ways potentially to analyze the associated impacts. So you really need to have a lot of sort of technical vision and a sort of a comprehensive strategy, sort of organizationally, to think about how to ultimately reconcile any differences, and to engage in the development of product category rules in a way that would move toward a more standardized process. If you're thinking about sort of the holy grail, which would be a common product category rule that could be used across a couple different industry groups, you might envision that a majority of the rules themselves would apply sort of across the different the different industry categories and their associated products and processes. And so that's sort of what it would look like. You sort of have the right categories of sort of analysis set up. But in terms of the process to get there, you obviously need to have your different program operators, your different industry groups starting to have conversation amongst themselves, and there's an actual term for that, which is mutual recognition. So they would be sitting down, and talking about what their impacts are, and what sort of a fair way of doing analysis, sort of in a way that that would be consistent to to these different groups and to their different paving sort of solutions. So again, you would have ideally sort of a template for the content and format of EPDs that would be consistent. There are actual examples of entities that have been created to work toward this goal of mutual recognition. One is the Program Operator Consortium, and another is the American Center for Life Cycle Assessment. And then FHWA is certainly interested in this and has published some best practices for product category rules and EPDs, and certainly are eager to make that information available for agencies that have an interest in this area. So so if you're wanting to get started, the question is, as an agency, where might you begin? And I think this is sort of an interesting approach, and not necessarily one that I would have thought of initially. But the first is to get entities to really start reporting. You develop rules, I think, as sort of as best you can. If it's possible to achieve some level of harmonization, that would be ideal. But I think most critically, just having the EPDs out there, I think gives I think sort of plants a flag, and also gives everyone something to think about and react to, and is sort of an adjunct component to that. I think the promotion of pilot projects for agencies requesting EPDs manufacturers, and then refining specs for the EPDs themselves, and then considering the ways that EPDs are used. I think, and in developing tools that can, life cycle assessment tools, for instance, that can use the information from EPDs as inputs. All of those are, I think, a good way to, to start, quantifying impacts, identifying gaps, and and providing a foundation to build on. The second step is really, beyond sort of the first, couple of years of, sort of starting a program, would involve the standardization of product category rules. And again, this is no small challenge, but working with other entities and industries to push for harmonization of product category rules, and again identifying gaps in public data sets or other data. That's I think that's all really important work. Potentially this process can be sort of pushed forward with incentives for providing plant specific environmental product declarations, as opposed to just sort of the use of industry averages. And and again, I continue to improve the use of EPDs in in pavement design and asset management. This is really important. And then we're ultimately all of this has the potential to make a real difference, is where EPDs are a real consideration in the procurement process. So it's not to say that EPDs are the final word. Obviously, there's some other factors that would likely play in some instances a larger role. But when you think about costs and performance, and and environmental performance being one aspect of performance, using information from EPDs to either establish performance requirements or making it a consideration in the procurement process means that there really is potential to sort of help move industry move forward, and I think as part of that that drive, that the hope is that the quality of the EPDs themselves gets better and better. And EPDs can be used for things other than just the bidding of specific specific projects, pavement management systems, or long-term maintenance and rehabilitation, or other examples of agency initiatives that could be informed through the use of EPDs, which really link environmental performance to the performance of the facilities that are being constructed. A couple quick summary points. Again, EPDs are a real resource in that that they provide transparent, verified sources of environmental impact information. And again, I think the point can't be made too strongly that that agencies can play a real role. That in addition to simply collecting the data, they can use the data for environmental analysis. They can push manufacturers or in some instances larger groups to develop EPDs that they can try to engage in that process in ways that that promotes agency and other public goals, and then ultimately consider EPDs as I'm sorry, I didn't advance that slide, but to consider EPDs for procurement. And then a few takeaway observations with respect to product category rules. Again, these are the guidelines, the industry consensus guidelines to actually develop EPDs, and I think the important observation here again is that public agencies can play I think an active and meaningful role in the the sort of technical content of the product category rules themselves. They're important in reviewing product category rules, and they can help bring industry to the table, and and I think help to drive the discussion toward this important issue of how you categorize product category rules. So I think that's it for my part of the presentation. I think, Monica, do I hand it back over to you?
Yes. Thank you, John, for a great job. So with that, we also have other products within the Sustainable Payments program, like our Towards Sustainable Payment Systems reference document. We have our Payment Lifecycle Assessment Framework. We also have other tech briefs on payment sustainability, lifecycle assessment, improving resiliency of payment systems, among others. We also have the recordings for the webinar series, the previous webinar series, and we have a copy of our program roadmap. You can find all these documents in our website. Other available resources and tools are the Payment LCA framework. We also have a tech brief on LCA and on life cycle thinking. In the chat box to the right, you'll be able to see a copy of the tech brief on EPDs. We also have a link to the federal LCA comments and other tools. We also have a document on what agencies need to know about payment LCA, and our LCA benchmarking tool should be ready in later on this fall. I was going to say 2020, but we are in 2020. So later on this fall, you can expect our LCA tool. And if you missed any of the webinars, we do have webinars 1 through 8 live in our YouTube channel, and the links are either in the presentation that you will receive, or you could find them all on our website. You could just type FHWA Sustainable Pavements Program in Google and it could lead you to our website, or if not, our link is provided in the next slide. So here's a link to our website, and if you have any questions, please contact Heather Dilla or myself, Monica Jurado. And with that, I'll open it up for questions with Kirk and pass on the microphone to Kirk. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Monica, and thank you, John. We appreciate that information. So we do have a few minutes now for questions and answers. Again, I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, to go ahead and use the question box on the control panel to submit your questions. Our FHWA panelist group that we have available today to answer your questions will be our speakers, John and Monica, and they are also joined by Ms. Heather Dilla. So we have 3 people representing FHWA today. And I think we'll first start with a question for John. John, general question was, can anybody develop an EPD, or do you need some kind of a certificate or certification process to be able to develop an official EPD?
That's a really good question, and I'm not aware of any certificate that would be issued or any for instance state level requirements that that entities producing an EPD be certified in any way. But I would defer to Heather or Monica if they have any further knowledge in that area.
John, you're correct. There is no certificate that's required as long as you find a program operator that has a PCR for your product category. You can create that EPD following the PCRs and the ISO standards. And if they were referring to, can anyone be a program operator? The question is yes, or the answer would be yes as well. Program operators are typically industries, non-government organizations, or standard associations. Some are maybe also consultancies. So that is also a possibility. But then if you're going to choose to be a program operator, you have to have general program instructions written first, which describes how you would manage that PCR flow chart and encourage public participation, who's going to be on that PCR committee to rate the PCRs, etc. And once that general program instructions are written, then you could go down the path of creating PCRs and then subsequently creating EPDs under those PCRs.
All right, thank you, Heather. And as long as you've got the floor, kind of maybe a 2-part question. One, what tools or what information is needed to develop an EPD, and if the same information and or data is available in those tools, would you expect to see the same results in the outputs?
That's a good question. So EPDs are really for businesses to communicate their environmental footprints to other businesses. That's one of the uses of EPDs. So they could be very plant specific and product specific. So you would expect differences due to how that plant is operating and what that particular product is and what are the material components in that product and where those material components come from and how impactful those components are, if it was an additive or you have aggregate or a binder per se. So there are differences. EPDs can be averaged. So if you are using them in an LCA of a pavement and you're looking at different pavement designs, you're going to want to use average EPDs, and industries tend to be publishing those average EPDs. Or program operators tend to publish these average EPDs. The reason why it's the industries and the program operators is you want to make sure that the EPDs in these averages have all the same modeling assumptions, background data sets used in them to calculate the EPDs. Some of the PCRs, as John prefaced in the presentation earlier, they're written and they gave options to choose, for example, the best available data. And when they give these options, then it can lead to some differences. And so it's going to take some time for these PCRs to start prescribing data sets, and then for these background data sets such as electricity to be harmonized amongst all the EPD programs out there. But eventually, we hope to get down to that path. Tools are needed or are often used to create EPDs. They're not needed, but I mean, if you're a lot of program operators either have LCA consultants that they work with that have tools that facilitate the industry to get those EPDs, and then another option is to actually create a tool that all of the EPDs under your program can use. And so that, it's said that having one tool does ensure that the EPDs that are made under that tool are definitely more comparable, just because of those modeling assumptions, and they would have all the same background data sets, allowing for some of that comparability. So that is certainly done. As far as data needed, you would be collecting a lot of the specific energy use, transportations, the quantities of materials, the particular emissions from the plant or that particular operating. So if you're thinking of cement, for example, the cement plant would look at the particular materials they use, the energy at their particular plant, and they could create an EPD. That EPD could then be used in a concrete mix EPD, and they could choose the particular cement manufacturer that they use and type of cement, and then include that in theirs to estimate the cement component, and then they would get the primary data from their plant that was all the mixing and energy used and any transportation distances. And so that's how they kind of build into other components of EPDs and eventually to a pavement LCA.
Thank you, Heather. And just kind of as a quick follow-up, you kind of touched on it. Just a general question on exactly what is meant by the term background data sets. Maybe if you could expand on that just a little.
Yeah, background data sets are background data. It means different things depending on who's doing the LCA. So it's very, very challenging to pinpoint a definition to background data. But generally speaking, if you think about it, it's the data that you need to estimate because it's not controlled by you at your process, at your plant particularly. So when we at FHWA talk about background data, we're thinking of a lot of the background data sets that would be similar across all the manufacturing processes. So we're thinking electricity, transportation, maybe water, landfilling. Some of these flows should be consistently used amongst industry. So if you're looking at steel manufacturing, what you use to estimate the impacts of generating that electricity or energy should be the same as wood, should be the same as concrete or asphalt. We should be all using the same background data sets.
All right, thank you, Heather. And John, let's go back to you. Maybe there's a point of clarification. Are the states California, Washington, and Minnesota, are they now requiring EPDs to bid paving projects?
My understanding is that they're not there yet. I think there's maybe a strong expectation that they will be there before too long. I think the only requirement that exists is very material specific. I think it's steel in California, and I can't remember if that's just for certain categories of construction projects. So again, I think I might need to defer to Heather, who I think is maybe a little bit more up to speed with developments on that front.
No, John, you did a good job answering that question. I would refer, California is the only one that actually has a law that's in place. It's, I believe, AB 262, so by the Buy Clean California Act. So you should review the specifics of that law and what are the timelines and schedules they have enacted, because they did enact it in several phases. I know they started off with the education phase, getting industry ready, then requesting them, and then I think the next phase was requiring EPDs, then which they will then set the thresholds for industry categories, and then I think the idea would be that you need to be lower, or they're choosing potentially materials that are under the industry thresholds. And John, you're correct. There are 5 materials in the California bill, and I don't remember them off the top of my head. But I think steel rebar was one of them, and then some fibers, and a couple other materials. But I would again reference going back to the California state law. Washington, Minnesota don't require. They had laws introduced. Washington, the law that passed was to do a study on how EPDs could be included in purchasing public procurement. I don't know where they are now, but I did know that there was some legislation following up from that study. The study is complete, and there's some video testimonies to the state of Washington government on the findings of that study, and they did propose new language, but I don't know where that new language is. Minnesota had, again, legislation introduced a year ago. That did not go through, to my knowledge. Minnesota DOT did do a study with stakeholders in educating on how EPDs could be used and looking at EPDs in general from the pavements perspective and DOT industry or DOTs. And then there is word that potentially, or 2 different bills that kind of have an emphasis on EPDs were potentially going to be introduced, but again, I don't know the status on those. Other states that I've heard word of similar legislation is Colorado, and then Oregon had also some legislation. And then the city of Portland is the other area that also does require them, and I think it's for concrete that they're requiring EPDs.
All right, thanks, Heather. And while you're at the microphone, we'll keep you up at the podium. The question is that cradle to gate EPDs state that they should not be used to compare different products, but the appears that agencies are going down that path. So the question is just to kind of hear your thoughts or your interpretation of that.
So with EPDs, if you're thinking of using EPDs, what we think at FHWA, you would first use the EPD you would collect EPDs, get averages of the different EPDs for the different types of materials. So if you know you have a rural asphalt roadway, you'd know that your average environmental impact is X. And you would use that in a full LCA. So we do agree with doing these cradle to grave LCAs, and that could inform your environmental footprint of that particular project. When you do that, I think you could come out with a threshold. And then when you go to procurement, then the idea would be industry could bid and try to get lower than that threshold. And your threshold would be set based off of the historical information of what in general is your environmental performance for that particular roadway design. In that case, you're assuming, just like you would in life cycle cost analysis, that the performance of those 2 mixtures are going to perform the same. And when you do make that assumption, then in those cases you don't need the full cradle to grave LCA. So if you have 2 mixtures that you think are going to perform the same, and it's between 2 material manufacturers, you can use those EPDs. But I preface in the fact that it should be EPDs from a PCR that's really high quality, potentially even just a tool. because when it's a tool, you know that it's comparable. Right now, there's many EPDs that can be produced by different consultants that have their own tools that use different data sets. So right now, yes, you don't know for sure whether those reductions are truly from the manufacturing processes. It could be from other assumptions and data used.
All right, thank you, Heather. And I think we are up against our time limit, so I think we're going to wrap things up right there. We apologize if we didn't get to your question, but as we've indicated previously, we are working to prepare 2 additional webinar events where we'll have the opportunity to answer all of the questions that have been raised in all of the different webinars. So I want to thank everyone for your time here today and your attention, and we hope that you found both the specific webinar today and the overall webinar series both helpful and informative. We'll be in touch with everyone regarding the scheduling of those 2 additional webinar events. And so be on the lookout for that, and also be on the lookout for your PDH certificates for today's session, as well as your course completion certificate if you completed 8 of the 10 webinar sessions. Please allow us a couple weeks in order to do all the final processing, though, before you expect to receive those documents. So thanks again, everyone. We appreciate your time, and have a good rest of the day. So long.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks.